these next 3 weeks, Kevin, are going to be absolutely critical for this season for KU basketball because you're about to have a time period where you're going to have a chance to do a ton of practicing, right? Because you're not going to have very many games in coming up with winter break and whatnot. So you're going to have the opportunity to do a lot of practice to really try to mold what you want to be come conference play.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible.
Pay heed all who enter, and beware this podcast. This is a paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. And unfortunately, I don't really want to do this, Kevin. I don't really want to talk about this, but unfortunately, a little bit of border war blues for Kansas basketball. They go to Columbia against Missouri, and it was basically like 30-ish minutes of pain, and then like a little bit of excitement for KU coming back. And then Mark Mitchell, who's a career like 10% three-point shooter, buries the game. Then Josh Gray, who's like a career 20% free throw shooter, goes 2 of 2. And KU loses on the road in Columbia against Missouri in the border war. 2 court stormings in the span of 5 days against Kansas after the Creighton loss last week. And then this one against Missouri. Really, really tough times for Kansas. Back-to-back losses as the number 1 team in the country. They're now 7-2. They lose 76-67 against Missouri. We're going to break that all down. As always, we're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And, of course, you can like and subscribe to the channel. You can drop a comment and share your thoughts with what you think might be the issue. We're going to be discussing that on this show here today. Kevin, I don't even know where to begin, man. I mean, it looked like, honestly, if we were going true to what KU did, we should basically just sit here and talk about nothing for like 30 minutes because that's what Kansas did. They just didn't, they weren't even playing the same sport as Missouri. It felt like for the first like 25 minutes of the game, just an absolute train wreck. They fight back though. I don't know. Where do you want to take this to start off?
I can say I wouldn't want to be a practice this week, Nick, after the way that thing went. And for their sake, I don't know that it'll get them out of whatever's going to happen this week, but the fact that they were able to battle back and make it a game late, I think almost saves a little bit of that reputation, maybe takes a little bit of the sting off. But generally speaking, Nick, from the opening tip, Kansas wasn't in this thing, and it wasn't in it in a lot of ways, right? We talked about in our show where we previewed the game, said, hey, here's Missouri's path to winning this thing. And it was, they're going to drive a bunch. They're going to drive into contact. They're going to get to the free throw line a bunch, and they're going to pile up points at the free throw line. One of the things that we didn't mention was that Kansas was just going to give the ball away like candy on Halloween. And that was the thing that I think really changed the complexion of everything, because Missouri out and out didn't have a great offensive game. And I think that a lot of that is because Kansas had a terrific defensive stretch during the comeback, and that's something that I'm sure we'll get to. But, Nick, the reason there was a comeback at all was Kansas was playing incredibly soft. Missouri was aggressive going to the basket like we knew they would, like was their game plan. But the other thing was Missouri was getting really handsy around the perimeter. And I'm not saying that as, they should have gotten called for that stuff. I think the officials were letting guys be handsy around the perimeter. The way that you were going to get calls was to be aggressive and get downhill. One of the two teams did it. The other team seemed almost content to throw the ball away quite a bit and lead to some run-out opportunities for Missouri.
Yeah, look, there was a stretch in the first half, Kevin, where I don't think Kansas got a shot up in it felt like 10 possessions in a row. They didn't even get a shot up. It was just immediately throwing it away, a terrible entry pass, trying to get it to Hunter Dickinson, or just total miscommunication, whatever it was. It just, the whole thing was just completely messed up in that first half. And yeah, the first half was one of the worst halves I've seen Kansas play in a long, long time. We've seen them play some bad halves of basketball But, the caveat to that is that those were against quality teams, or like, you think about some of the halves they had in like the NCAA tournament where they lost, like against Villanova in the Final Four. Villanova was a Final Four quality team, obviously. Gonzaga last year, another really great.
We'll win the national title that year. Yeah, it just shot the cover off the ball. And
yeah,
no, I don't cut you off, but like the circumstances and everything behind it, I do think this may have been the worst half of basketball in Bill Self's tenure at Kansas. And I'm not saying Missouri's bad. I don't want to say that. But I do think that so many of the issues that Kansas had yesterday were self-inflicted. You were talking about that stretch, Nick. I think during that exact stretch, KU turned the ball over twice because they were standing out of bounds when somebody threw them the ball. That's not a Missouri thing. That's hey, look down at your feet. Are you in the court of play? Are you not? There was a turnover that Zeke Mayo made it at one point where he left his feet in the middle of nowhere and just had to get rid of it and throw it to a Missouri defender. That's not necessarily a Missouri mistake. That's hey, don't leave your feet when you have no idea where you're going with the basketball. And there were a lot of those, a lot of lazy passes, a lot of, hey, maybe you have the entry pass here to the post, but you're throwing it out of bounds instead. And so that to me was what makes this different from, say, Gonzaga, which you were talking about, where Gonzaga was playing great pick and roll basketball and just picking Kansas apart. It was a really good offense, a bad matchup with KU's defense, and they just picked KU apart. In this game, so many of the wounds that Kansas suffered were self-inflicted wounds.
Yeah. I mean, Kansas has played bad halves where the opponent played really well, right? And this, for the first half specifically, was less about what we were just talking about. It was less about Missouri playing well or doing anything like crazy. It was just more about Kansas playing just absolutely atrocious. Like I said, it didn't even feel like they were playing the same sport for a stretch. They're like, I don't know what Kansas thought they were doing or what sport they thought they were playing, but it didn't seem like it was basketball for a stretch there as well. So yeah, very frustrating. And you touched on Zeke Mayo, and I do think Zeke Mayo deserves a little bit of a deeper conversation here because Kevin, he, in the Creighton game, he made a couple big threes for Kansas that kind of helped spark them a little bit. He's hit some big shots to start this season for KU, but in this Missouri game, he looked basically completely lost. I mean, it was really, really a troublesome game for him. He looked scared to shoot, inconsistent, right? And he, like, the one guy that Kansas can't have be scared to shoot is Zeke Mayo, because I think as of right now, I mean, I guess maybe not at this point, but heading into this game against Missouri, I think the argument could be made that he's by far KU's best shooter and most reliable shooter. And you can't have that guy being scared to shoot. So I don't know. Is there any concern for you with Zeke Mayo? Or I guess we can really kind of expand this to all of the transfers, right? I mean, Rylan Griffin, AJ Storr, really all three of those guys. I think kind of the quote unquote big three transfers with AJ Storr, Rylan Griffin, and Zeke Mayo. I guess where are you at with those guys? Because this was a game where all three of them really struggled. I mean, Zeke Mayo 4 points, Rylan Griffin 3 points, and AJ Storr only 2 points on 1 of 7 from the floor. That ain't gonna cut.
Yeah, and Diggy Coit was the guy that actually showed up and made some.
I do want to get into Yes, I do want to get into Diggy Coit.
It's tough, I think, because you go to a new school and nobody wants to hear excuses. But Hubert Davis was talking. I think it was during COVID or whatever, and he said, we have some guys that haven't even been to buildings on campus, in terms of being new guys and coming in. And obviously that's not necessarily a concern, but when you come into a new school, you are going to a campus you aren't used to. You're going classes in new places. If you got to get away from the world for a little bit, you don't have a spot necessarily that you know of where you can get away from everything. Everything is different, and that's in addition to new coach, new system. And I think with the transfers in this case, one of the difficult things has been the way that the minutes have kind of come and gone, right? Like there have been some games where, hey, this guy is maybe going to get 30 minutes in this game. And there have been other where it's closer to 10 or 15. I know Bill Self is kind of going with the hot hand, if you will, but I almost wonder if that's doused a couple hands along the way where guys aren't playing through things and getting a chance to maybe take that next step because they're looking over at the bench thinking, hey, something bad could happen here if I miss this. One of the interesting things with Zeke Mayo was when we did our episode breaking down the Creighton loss and previewing this game, one of the things we said was we felt like by the end of the year, Zeke Mayo and Hunter Dickinson would be the closers offensively on this team. You know, if you needed somebody to hit a shot, it was probably going to be Zeke Mayo. If you needed, 2 points, you were probably going to try and find a way to get the ball to Hunter Dickinson around the basket. And so to go from that a game ago, coming out of that being the take and having this one where, like you said, he really looked lost. You look at, the fact that he didn't shoot the ball well. He seemed hesitant. I think he had 4 turnovers as well. When you add all of that up, it was a really troublesome performance. Another guy I think that's really interesting here, Nick, is AJ Storr. And we've talked about AJ Storr a lot on this show because I do think that Rylan Griffin has maybe the most direct path where it's like we know what Rylan Griffin needs to do to play, right? He needs to defend and he needs to make shots. And that's it right there. I mean, yes, you can stand to not have him make bad decisions, throw the ball away, but generally speaking, 3-and-D is going to be his way forward. With AJ Storr, he was actually on the court for a lot of Kansas's comeback, and he was doing some really good things defensively. He had the held ball where he got Kansas a possession back. I thought he defended Tamar Bates pretty well at times, but the offensive confidence wasn't there. And in a game where, like we talked about, the officials are really rewarding guys for driving into contact, that's AJ Storr. That's his strength level. And so to see him kind of drive halfway, wind up taking, a 6 or an 8 footer rather than making that extra step to get that thing into contact, getting to the free throw line, it showed, I thought, a lack of confidence on his part. Nick, you remember obviously Illinois' team a year ago and how long and they I think were a pretty solid approximation from a defensive standpoint of what Missouri is, in terms of the length that they have at different positions. In the Big Ten tournament title game, AJ Storr had 24 points and he got to the free throw line 10 times. And I think, I'm not saying he had to have 24 points and get to the free throw line 10 times, but I do think that this was a game where the opportunity for a big AJ Storr game was there if AJ Storr played to his strengths. And to your point about Zeke Mayo looking lost, you want him to shoot, etc. You want AJ Storr to drive. You want him to do that because he's so difficult to stop with this combination of length, strength, and body control. And so with him not really taking advantage of what seemed like, at least on the surface, a quote-unquote AJ Storr game, I think that was pretty worrisome too.
Yeah, well, and look, I think bigger picture beyond that, Bill Self had a very interesting comment kind of tied into that conversation about AJ Storr and about the lineup for Kansas in I'm basically paraphrasing here when he said something along the lines of, I know who the 5 starters should be, but I don't know that they are in a position to do that yet, which I think was a real head scratcher for some people.
Yeah.
I think kind of to your point, it's essentially Bill Self really openly challenging certain individuals. I think probably AJ Storr, Rylan, the transfers being those guys of, hey, look, you are good enough to be the starter. You just have to do the right thing and play kind of the way that Bill Self wants to play. But that can be really frustrating, right? Because I think there are other people that are really tired of seeing, a lineups with 3 non-shooters on the floor when you roll out with KJ Adams and DeJuan Harris, and then, you end up with Zach Clements in there or whatever, so on and so forth. Like it's clear who KU's best players should be, but they, for whatever reason, it's not panning out that way. And that's kind of what Bill Self was saying, I guess. But I don't know. It's it's interesting because I think that kind of goes back to your point about Bill Self using the hot hand, right? Like he wants to go with the guys that are giving the best effort, even at the expense, even of from an outside perspective at least, at the expense of having a less effective lineup essentially on the floor.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things too is, and we talked about this heading into the season, Bill Self knows what he wants and or needs to win a national championship. And we talked about specifically with AJ Storr, there's a certain version of AJ Storr that Bill Self feels like he needs to win the national championship. And that's an AJ Storr that defends, that rebounds, that does a lot of the little things. The issue is that Kansas isn't going to win the national title without AJ Storr attacking on offense as well. And so, and the other thing too, and Bill Self, I don't need to say this, but he knows more about basketball than I ever will. But I do think that there is a case to be made that when you're pulling somebody for not doing the right things, you're not necessarily giving them a chance to work into doing the right things. And you're also having them look over their shoulder for the hook as opposed to doing the things that make them a good basketball player, to have them relax and play. And it feels like guys are playing pretty tight right now, where they aren't playing loose and free and playing to their strengths. And so I do think it is something that, yeah, Bill Self has been better than maybe any coach in college basketball over the last 10, 15 years of breaking guys down and then building them back up. At the same time, a lot of coaches talk about, hey, the best coach in the world is the bench, right? Because if a guy makes a mistake, hey, you're sitting over here next to me, don't make the mistake again. I almost wonder with these guys, with them being transfers, with them being new to the program, whether it's the sort of thing where they need that court time to really get to where they need to be, as opposed to using the bench as the best coach in basketball.
All right, I do want to talk more about this game, more about what it means big picture, some of the little bit of positives that we might get to here coming up on the other side. We do want to take a break here, but as always, got to tell you about Home Field Apparel. Folks, holidays are right here, man. You got less than basically 2 weeks until Christmas, so time to get shopping and head over to Home Field Apparel for some of the best college gear around. They've got great Kansas gear. Listen, you may not want to be repping Kansas after a game like that against Missouri, but the gear is fantastic. Slam and Jam and Jayhawks, phenomenal. One of the best basketball shirts they have. So they've got Kansas, and they've got 130 plus other schools. I'm rocking Ball State here today, a whole chirp. By the way, Timothy Chalamet picking Ohio on College Game Day and then blowing out Miami in the MAC title game. That was crazy. So maybe he is.
He does have a talent for prophecy in the movie Dune, Nick. So
correct.
Maybe that carried over from his performance in Dune.
Yes, I was not expecting that, but there you go. Timothy Chalamet, ball. And if you know ball, you know that you should be shopping at Home Field Apparel. Use the promo code PAID24, 15% off your first order. More KU basketball talk coming up next.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
This is the Baby Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you're listening to, or if you're watching on YouTube at Kansas Tech's KCSN, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a 5-star rating and review, or drop a comment on the YouTube channel to share your thoughts on what has been a bit of a difficult past week for Kansas basketball with 2 road losses as the number 1 team, including most recently against Missouri. Okay, Kevin, speaking of the little things, David Coit.
Yeah.
He was one of the guys that really showed up in the game. Sorry. That may have come off a bit mean, speaking of little things, David Coit, but he's he's a little guy. But listen,
he is a short king, as the kids would say.
There you go, Kevin. That's a good save. David Coit really was the spark plug that Kansas needed in this game, right? I mean, without him, you mentioned it earlier, Kansas may lose this game by 30 points, but he stepped up big time, ended the game with 14 points, went 4 of 7 from 3, and was really a solid defender at times as well. He really was what got Kansas back in the game.
Yeah, and you look at what he did, it was more in line, I think, with what you want David Coit to do. There have been times this year where David Coit has gone and taken a well-defended 18-footer where you say, hey, you're probably not going to shoot over that guy. I appreciate the confidence, but no, his ability to shoot the ball and shoot the ball from distance has come in handy at this point. And with the Shaq Moore situation, up in the air as he continues to deal with his injury, he's the number 2 point guard, and he's a guy that can come off and give you some instant offense. He absolutely did in this game, and did in a spot where Kansas had to have it, Nick, because Kansas was defending at an outstanding level for a while. And I think it was encouraging for a number of reasons. One, people are wondering, hey, with Hunter Dickinson out there, are you going to be able to defend at a high level? There are different questions there. Kansas defended incredibly well for a while, and that was a big part of the reason for the Kansas comeback in this thing. But also, you got to make shots, and Kansas wasn't having an easy time putting the ball in the basket. Coit was one of the few guys that really helped them out there and hit some huge shots when they had to have it.
Yeah, and look, with Coit, I think we kind of talked about it earlier in the season about him, like, just because of his lack of size, it feels like there may be certain games where it's going to be tough for him to play a lot just based off of, the opponent. And early on in the game, it felt like this was a game where you weren't going to be able to utilize him very much because Mizzou was running out very big lineups. I mean, they had lineups out there with multiple guys, 6'8" plus really, and really trying to utilize that. And so I was a little nervous about David Coit getting a ton of minutes in this game, but listen, he's a bulldog. I mean, he is just an absolute fighter. And I think that's probably exactly why Bill Self went to him as much as he did in this game, because he was one of the few guys on this team that was showing a lot of fight, especially when KU was down big. They got down by as much as 24 in the second half with about 15 minutes left. Then you go on the 15-0 run to cut it back to 9, and you're basically right back in the game from there. And again, Coit was a part of that, certainly. And then, it's really back and forth from then on, right? And it kind of got to the point where I was like, KU's going to win this game, I think.
Yeah.
And then you cut it to 2, and then obviously you have the Mark Mitchell play followed by Josh Gray hitting a couple free throws that really kind of sank KU. But yeah, that was kind of one of the big difference makers. We talked about the turnovers. KU finished the game with 22 turnovers. I think they had 15 in the first half, I believe.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? 15 in the first half. So they did a much better job of taking care of the ball, obviously, in the second half. Missouri, by the way, had just 11 turnovers, and then obviously the free throws were a big difference as well. Missouri ends up going 26 of 31 from the line, which is absurd. I think we touched on it in our preview. Missouri is a top 5 team in the country in terms of free throw attempts per game, and that continued in this game against Kansas. Listen, kudos to Missouri, I guess, for winning, but I kind of mentioned it with the Creighton game too. Like, I've come away now from these 2 losses with Kansas against Creighton and Missouri, not overly impressed with the opponent as much as I'm overly disappointed with Kansas, right? Like, with Creighton, it was one guy got hot and they were able to hit a bunch of shots at different points when they needed to.
And a guy that's not even playing the rest of the season.
That's now having hip surgery and is out for the year. Yeah. And then in this Missouri game, I wasn't overly impressed with Missouri's offense either. I mean, it felt like they were just driving to get fouled or whatever. And so and obviously again, it was because of Kansas turning the ball over and giving them so many easy points as well, especially in the first half. So I don't know. I mean, people may come for me, I guess, for saying like, well, these 2, Creighton and Missouri, didn't deserve to win. Like, they definitely did because Kansas played so poorly. But I don't know. I'm not coming away from these games thinking that these other 2 teams played really, really well to beat KU as much as just KU played really, really horribly. And so I guess on one hand, that's frustrating, but on the other hand, it can be encouraging then that you hope that KU can get things going. And listen, I will say this. These next 3 weeks, Kevin, are going to be absolutely critical for this season for KU basketball, because you're about to have a time period where you're going to have a chance to do a ton of practicing, right? Because you're not going to have very many games in coming up with winter break and whatnot. So you're going to have the opportunity to do a lot of practice, to really try to mold what you want to be come conference play. And Bill Self has talked about this in the past. And really, this is just kind of an overarching theme of sports, is that at some point during the season, you just kind of are who you are, right? Like, you eventually, the time for you to kind of be, become what you want to be, that runs out, right? So this is kind of that window, I think, for Kansas to sort of figure that out, because, Bill Self has said it a number of times, the Big 12 is an absolute monster. There's no question about that. So conference play is going to be, an absolute dogfight night in and night out. And there's not going to be an opportunity for Kansas to really make any sort of big macro changes or really have any real growth opportunities. So to me, it's really these next 3 weeks. It's between now and New Year's, right? Where you're going to have basically one game a week. You're going to have NC State coming up on Saturday. Then you don't have another game until Brown on December 22nd. So you got 8 days, and then you have 9 days until you start conference play against West Virginia. That's a lot of time to get on the practice floor and try to figure some things out. And I just hope that KU can do that and figure out kind of where they are going to be, because once conference play starts, Kevin, I don't think there's going to be much of an opportunity for KU to really have that chance to grow in any sort of way or really change, from a bigger perspective. So it's really, to me, now or never for this team to sort of figure some things out a little bit before conference play.
Yeah, you can grow during conference play, I think, but it is a lot more difficult, to your point. I think you look at that 2018 season, and obviously you're adding Silvio in later in that season, so you have an addition of a player that kind of spurred that. But here you have a situation where potentially you could be adding Shaq Moore in, maybe, you're adding a guy in without actually adding him in, right? With a guy maybe taking off and starting to play really well at some point. But to your point, yeah, these are maybe the most important weeks of the season for them to get there, because you don't get breaks during conference season.
Exactly.
You're playing so many good teams game after game after game that there's not really a chance for you to say, oh, we're playing somebody that's not very good this week, so we're gonna try out AB. No, that doesn't happen. And so when you look at it sort of long term over the course of the season, these next few weeks are going to be huge for Kansas, sort of deciding who it and what it is. And to your point, even before that, I think it was well made, because if Kansas went out against, say, Duke and just got its butt kicked, where you just said, hey, Duke's the better team, I think that would have worried me more, as weird as that sounds, because you would say, well, gosh, is KU going to be good enough to win a game like that? Against Creighton, we talked about it. There are two different ways to take care of the basketball. One is to, not turn the ball over. The other is to get good shots on the other side of that. And we talked about against Creighton, Kansas did a good job on part A of that. They didn't turn the ball over a whole lot, but they weren't getting good shots. They were rushing shots. They were taking shots they didn't need to take. And so there were certain things there. The defense wasn't as sharp. And like you said, a guy had a big game against Missouri. All credit to Missouri. Missouri was incredibly intense and up and ready for this game. They played with a frenetic energy, especially early on, that really impacted that game. But I didn't come away from the game feeling like, oh, Kansas isn't good enough to beat Creighton. Kansas isn't good enough to beat Missouri. And I think when you watch games early on in the season, not that teams can't get better, but I think that that's more what you're watching for, right? Is because you figure the consistency is going to get better. You're going to lock in at different levels. And so the biggest issue would just be, hey, what if we're not good enough this year? Kansas hasn't shown me yet this year, Nick, that it's not good enough. I think that Kansas has shown so far that it hasn't been focused enough at times, and that's led to a couple losses. But this is still a team that has a lot of tools, a lot of depth, a lot of different things that they can do, a lot of different ways that they can attack you. And if they can get some of these guys, get the version of Zeke Mayo that we've seen at times, get AJ Storr attacking off of the bounce, get Rylan Griffin to fill that 3-and-D role really nicely. I do think that this is a Kansas team that has all the tools to do what they want to do this season. And the Creighton and Missouri losses haven't changed that for me at all, even if they were poor performances.
You kind of answered one of the questions I was going to ask you about this team, which is kind of zooming out. Is there any legitimate reason to be really worried about the trajectory of the season, basically off of this week, right? And I think I think you and I are probably on the same page. Like, hey, these two losses really suck. Obviously, losing to Missouri is really, really terrible, and it just sucks, right? It sucks seeing those clowns have fun. But beyond that, it's 1 week in December, right? You can recover from this. If this happens again in February, where you have a couple really bad losses, that's where okay, now it's concern time. There's still plenty of time to recover and figure some things out for this team right now. But again, you look at conference play, it's going to be 2 games a week until the end of February. So if you have a bad week or a bad 10 days, that's going to probably mean you just lost 3 conference games in a row, right? Which is going to be really tough to stomach. I will ask you this though: both these games, Kansas, true road games, right?
Yeah,
they're undefeated, obviously. Then they go on the road, they lose against Creighton, then they go on the road again, they lose against Missouri. I think the stat was they're 3-10 in their last 13 road games going back to the conference play last year. I mean, how concerned are you about this team's ability to play on the road and try to win some games, right? Because eventually you get to the point where, touched on it, Bill Self has never been lower than a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament in his time at Kansas. But if you go out and you are going to lose 8-9 road games in conference play this year, you're probably going to be a lower seed in the NCAA tournament. So I don't know. Is there anything to that, you think, with this team playing true road games at this point? I mean, is it something that they can change? Is it how worried are you potentially about that?
I'm not super worried about it, Nick. And I think, obviously they've lost their first 2 this year, so they're 0-2. But generally speaking, I hesitate to link this year's team with last year's team. You only have 3 players really that played on last year's team back this year. I mean, I know Jamari McDowell is there, but he's redshirting. Elmarco Jackson is there, but he's hurt.
The Zach Clemence erasure is insane.
Oh my gosh! So, Zach Clemence redshirted last year, right?
He did, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, come on now. But anyways, I don't think that they have the same flaws, and for all of the downsides of the Missouri loss. And I realize that people are so scarred from last year that, like, when they lost to Creighton, they were like, oh my God, that's how we lost games last year. Like, this is going to happen all over again. I don't see that, Nick. And one of the few positives to come out of the Missouri game is, honestly, I think last year's team loses that by 30 points. When you look at what happened when they went on the road and were just kind of thumped like that, when you look at the Houston game, when you look at the Texas Tech game is the one that really jumps out. They were just sort of non-competitive after they got jumped on. And in this one, you get jumped on, you get all the way down where you're down 24 points. And it's not the easiest thing to get down in a defensive stance and defend one possession at a time when you're down 20 points. And they did that. And the defensive stands were what allowed them to bring this thing. Would they get it to 2, I think, at 65-63? Yeah. And so with 2.5 minutes left, like you mentioned earlier, some, as us video game players call it, some RNG, random number generation, with Mark Mitchell hitting.
Or how about just complete BS?
Well, the one thing I will say, Nick, Mark Mitchell this year is shooting 25% from 3. What did he shoot in that game? 25%. He was 1 for 4. So he hit right on his percentage. It just happened that one came when Missouri absolutely had to have it. The free throw was kind of funny because
Josh Gray, not like
he bricked that thing.
Yes,
and it went in. But at the same time, you were able to battle back and make that a game in a way that I'm not sure last year's team would have been capable and or willing to do. And I think because of that, I'm coming out of this, I don't want to say positive because you lost that game, but I am coming out of it feeling like this isn't going to be another year where Kansas struggles on the road to that same extent, because I do think they have a counterpunch. I do think that they've got more fight in them than before. I think last year's team, as we talked about it at the time, when Hunter Dickinson gets ejected against Duke, I think they lose that game and potentially even lose it by 8-10 points. And so I do think there's more battle in this team. I just think, to your point, to Bill Self's point, they need to have certain guys figure things out. But at the same time, I don't think we're going to be sitting here saying at the end of the year, man, Kansas just can't win games on the road again. I think that, I don't want to say this was an outlier performance, but I do think that Kansas is going to be better on the road this year than it was last year.
Yeah, look, that Texas Tech game last year in Lubbock was about as bad as it gets.
Yeah.
And my takeaway from that game last year, and I think for Hunter Dickinson, I'll give him a little bit of credit. Hunter Dickinson, he really paints himself as like, I want to be the bad guy. I want to be the villain, like, come at me, whatever, right? And there were some games last year, the Texas Tech game in specific, where if you want to be that guy, you better show up, right? Like, you better show up in those games. And he didn't do that very much. But, against Missouri, I think he finished with 19 and 14 for KU, played 34 minutes, also had 4 marks in the game.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually did a solid job defensively for as much as everybody wants to get after him for his defense, and a lot of times rightly so. I thought he did a pretty good job of helping out. There were a couple times where Missouri had to drive and he kind of got, screened out, where he wasn't able to challenge at the level that he would have wanted to challenge a shot. But generally speaking, I thought that he played a lot better defensively against Missouri than he has.
Now, he is credited with 7 turnovers, Kevin. I don't know if some of those were just bad. I don't know how they track it with like the passes. It felt like some of it was like entry passes that had no chance. I don't know.
Hunter Dickinson having 7 turnovers. I'm not saying his turnover numbers weren't high, but I think he got drilled for every potential turnover that involved Hunter Dickinson.
That's what I'm saying.
In that,
I'm not sure how they calculate that number, but he ended up with 7 if you look at the box score in that game. So, yeah, David Court obviously seems like a guy that's going to be a fighter in road games. People wonder why KJ Adams plays so much, because he's a fighter. Because he's that type of player, even if he has some limitations in other areas. So
they have some done stuff with him cutting off the ball against Missouri. I thought that, I think a lot of teams have adjusted to sort of that short roll game that we've seen him be so effective at. He's not necessarily getting the opportunities in the short roll that we've seen him get before. I think that's a fairly high item on people's scouting report. Against Missouri, I thought it was encouraging the way that he was cutting to the basket, that he was, cutting off the ball. It was kind of unfortunate. He had one where he had a really good cut, but wound up standing out of bounds when he probably would have had a layup. But I did think, if you're looking for a way to get him a little bit more involved, Nick, one of the things that Kevin McCullough did so freaking well was cut off the ball and was able to get a few buckets here or there in that way. And you look at that 3 spot, whether it's AJ Storr, whether it's Rylan Griffin, the cuts haven't been there to that same level. It was encouraging to see the way that KJ cut against Missouri. I thought that was another sort of positive takeaway from that game.
I will say, I am concerned about Floyd Vidunga in road games. It's not quite the same for him there, right? Like,
yeah,
Hunter Dickinson played 34 minutes. That's not going to be good enough, especially in conference play. That number needs to be quite a bit lower. And that means that Floyd Vidunga needs to be, available and able to play a little bit more. Either that, or I guess Zach Clements. I don't know. Like that's not a recipe for long-term success for Kansas. That basically you're almost repeating last year with that, where if he's playing over 30, if Hunter Dickinson's playing over 30 minutes a game, you're probably going to have him worn down and beaten up by the time you get to February and March, which is basically exactly what happened last year. So I am tentatively concerned about that. Hopefully, I have very high hopes for Flory, and I think Flory can and will be a really excellent player for KU, but hopefully it happens sooner rather than later. So,
yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that to what we've talked about with Flory before, his energy level can be really effective, and this would have been a game I think that they really could have used sort of the Flory with his hair on fire, grabbing rebounds, dunking, getting into tough spots. This was a game that KU could have used that energy boost, especially in that first half, and didn't quite get enough out of Flory in that situation.
KU is going to come back to Allen Fieldhouse to play against NC State. They have 2 more non-conference games before they kick off conference play against West Virginia on New Year's Eve. They got NC State on Saturday, and then Brown on December 22nd. So a chance maybe for KU again with these gaps in between games over winter break to really focus on themselves and try to get things turned around a little bit after this tough week with 2 losses, including against your arch rival in Missouri. That's going to wrap things up for this edition of the Paid Podcast. Tons happening in the offseason for KU basketball, or for KU football, in the offseason. Obviously, KU basketball in the regular season. KU football in the offseason. The transfer portal, by the way, opened today on Monday, December 9th. So we potentially may be more news coming out of that. Jalen Daniels is staying at KU. Canes is making some changes as coordinator. Had a sort of an emergency pod about that over the weekend. If you want to check that out as well, you can on our feed on KCSN. I'm sure we'll be talking probably more KU football coming up in the next couple of weeks with news that breaks out of that. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. And of course, we'll be covering KU basketball as well. But until then, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer, and we'll talk to you again soon. See ya.